Before Robert's Rebellion, before the Mad King, before the War of the Five Kings, there was a conflict that broke the Targaryen dynasty so completely that it never fully recovered. It lasted 60 years, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives across 5 separate wars. It was known as the Blackfyre Rebellion. Our story begins when the Targaryen dynasty was already nearly 2 centuries old. Aegon the Conqueror had completed his conquest of Westeros in 1 AC with 3 dragons and a vision of a unified realm. He had forged 6 kingdoms into one beneath the shadow of those great beasts, and the iron throne he built from the melted swords of his defeated enemies had passed from father to son, mother to child, across 11 reigns. For most of that time, the dragons had been the guarantee behind the crown. No lord, however proud or powerful, was eager to test his banners against fire that could melt castle walls. But the dragons were long gone by the time this story takes place. The last of them, a small, sickly green creature, stunted and misshapen compared to the great beasts of the conquest, had died in 153 AC during the reign of Aegon the Third. That king had watched his own mother devoured by a dragon during the civil war that preceded his rule, and it was said he had never forgiven the creatures for it. Whether the last dragon died of neglect, disease, or something more deliberate, historians have never agreed. What was certain was that her death closed an age. For 19 years before Aegon the Unworthy took his throne, the Targaryens had ruled without dragons, relying instead on tradition, prestige, and the careful management of a realm that had never truly forgotten what fire from above looked like. Into this changed world came Aegon the Fourth, who took the Iron Throne in 172 AC. He would reign for 12 years, and history has not been kind to him. His epithet, Aegon the Unworthy, was not bestowed by enemies. It was the considered verdict of his own realm, and it was earned. He had not always been what he became. As a young prince, Aegon was said to be handsome, skilled with lance and sword, and magnetic at court. He loved to hunt and dance, and he dazzled the lords around him with his wit. The seeds of his later failures were always present, but in youth they were easy to overlook. By the end of his reign, however, there was nothing left to overlook. He had grown so morbidly obese that his legs could no longer support his body, and he spent his final years confined to a couch, bloated and rotting, his skin reportedly crawling with worms, before he was even dead. The Septons who attended his passing called it a judgment of the gods. The maesters, more practically, called it the inevitable result of a life spent in total excess. He had been married to his sister, Nerys, as was Targaryen custom, and by every account he treated her with contempt. She was a gentle, pious woman who wished for nothing more than to enter the faith and live out her life in a sept. Aegon denied her this repeatedly, forcing her back to the marriage bed even after difficult childbirths nearly killed her. She gave him a true-born son, Daeron, and a daughter, Daenerys, and she suffered through the pregnancies with an indifference from her husband that bordered on cruelty. Daeron, the true-born heir, was everything Aegon did not want in a son. He was bookish and diplomatic, more interested in statecraft than warfare. His father publicly scorned him, and there were whispers that Aegon himself may have encouraged, that Daeron was not truly his son at all, but the bastard of Aemon the Dragon Knight, Aegon's own brother, who had long been close to Nerys. Aemon was a man of tremendous honour who served as Lord Commander of the King's Guard, and the accusation was almost certainly false. But Aegon wielded it as a weapon against his son's legitimacy without ever having the conviction to make it stick formally. When a knight named Sir Morgil Hastwyck stepped forward to accuse Nerys of adultery in open court, Aemon met him in trial by combat and killed him. The matter was considered settled by the gods. What Aegon could not do through law, he tried to do through favoritism. His preferred child was not Daeron at all, but a bastard. A boy named Daemon Waters, born of Aegon's cousin Daena, who had been kept locked away in the Maiden Vault by a previous king to prevent exactly this kind of entanglement. Daena, known as Daena the Defiant, had lived up to her name by somehow managing a secret affair with Aegon, and the result was Daemon, born in 170 AC. From the beginning, Aegon lavished attention on this boy in ways he never extended to his true-born heir. When Daemon was 12 years old, Aegon did something that sent a ripple of unease through the entire realm. He gave the boy the sword Blackfyre. This was not merely a gift. Blackfyre was the ancestral Valyrian steel sword of House Targaryen, the blade that Aegon the Conqueror himself had carried during the conquest. For nearly 2 centuries, it had passed from king to king as a symbol of dynastic legitimacy. Giving it to an acknowledged bastard, however beloved, was a statement that required no words. The realm understood exactly what Aegon intended, or at least what he wished everyone to believe he intended. Daemon Waters was his true heir in his father's eyes, no matter what the laws of succession said. Daemon himself was difficult to resent, which was part of the problem. He grew into a man of remarkable gifts. He was a born warrior, fearless and skilled, and he had the kind of effortless charisma that made men want to follow him. Lords and knights who had every reason to be loyal to the crown found themselves drawn to Daemon not out of disloyalty, but simply because he was extraordinary to be around. He competed in tourneys and won them. He inspired men in ways that Daeron, for all his genuine ability, simply did not. Even the common people loved him. There was something about Daemon Blackfyre that made the question of his birth seem beside the point. But the realm also had its share of men whose loyalties were shaped by grievance rather than admiration. Aegon the Unworthy had spent 12 years filling his court with flatterers, selling offices to the highest bidder, and making enemies of anyone with the nerve to tell him the truth. Lords who had been humiliated, houses that had been stripped of lands through his petty whims, men who had been passed over for positions they deserved. These were the Kindling. Daemon Blackfyre was not their cause so much as their excuse. Among Aegon's acknowledged bastards, 4 had been born to women of noble blood, and these were known as the Great Bastards. Daemon was the eldest and most celebrated, but there were others who would matter greatly to this story. Aegor Rivers, born to Lady Barbara Bracken in 172 AC, was everything a warrior should be: fierce, direct, and absolutely loyal to those he loved. He adored Daemon, and the bond between the two would shape everything that followed. He would become known to history as Bittersteel, a name that suited him in ways that only became clear later. Then there was Brynden Rivers, born to Lady Melissa Blackwood in 175 AC. He was a different kind of man entirely, slender and pale, with a great wine-red birthmark that crawled from his neck across the right side of his face. He was called Bloodraven, and where Bittersteel burned hot, Bloodraven was cold and calculating, a master of intelligence and intrigue. He wielded a Valyrian steel blade called Dark Sister, and commanded a network of spies and informants so pervasive that men joked he had 1,000 eyes and one. He chose to support the true-born Targaryen line, and the history of Westeros would have looked very different had he not. There was also Shiera Seastar, born to the Lysene noblewoman Serene of Lys, and considered one of the great beauties of her age. She becomes important to this story not as a combatant, but as a source of further bitterness. Bittersteel loved her desperately, and she refused him. Bloodraven, it was said, was her companion instead. The hatred between these 2 half-brothers was personal as much as political. Aegon the Unworthy died in 184 AC in the 12th year of his reign. He was 49 years old and had the body of a man decades older, consumed by a lifetime of excess. His death was slow and wretched. But before it came, he managed one final act that would prove to be the most consequential of his reign, more damaging than any of the policies or cruelties that had preceded it. In his last days, he issued a decree. All of his bastard children were to be legitimized. Every one of them, from the great bastards born to high-born ladies, down to the forgotten children of common women. Historians have debated his motives ever since. Some believe it was a final act of vengeance against Daeron, whom Aegon had spent a lifetime despising, a way of stripping his heir's legitimacy of its uniqueness, of saying that true-born birth was no more special than any other kind of birth. Others believe it was a calculated attempt to give Daemon the legal standing to press a claim, the thing Aegon had always wanted but could never openly deliver. It may have been both at once, or neither, the impulsive lashing out of a dying man who wanted to leave chaos as his legacy. Whatever the reasoning, the consequences were not in doubt. The decree could not be undone. Once legitimate, Daemon Blackfyre was no longer just an admired warrior and a king's favourite. He was a legitimate son of a Targaryen king, holding the ancestral sword of the dynasty, beloved by lords and common folk alike, with powerful men in his corner who had every reason to want a change of rule. Daeron II was now king. He was a capable, intelligent man, thoughtful where his father had been rash, generous where his father had been spiteful, genuinely interested in the welfare of his realm in a way Aegon never had been. But he had inherited a catastrophe. His father had spent 12 years turning capable men into enemies and lavishing attention on a bastard son who now had a legal claim to the very throne Daeron sat upon. The realm was governed by law and tradition and the loyalty of lords, and those loyalties had just been set on fire. It would take 11 more years before the first sword was drawn, but the match had already been struck. The Blackfyre Rebellion did not begin in 196 AC when the banners were raised. It began in the last fetid hours of Aegon the Unworthy's reign, in the moment he pressed his seal to a document and handed the Seven Kingdoms a war it would spend the better part of a century trying to survive. When Daeron II took the Iron Throne in 184 AC, he inherited a realm that his father had spent 12 years quietly poisoning. The court was filled with flatterers and opportunists who had prospered under Aegon's corruption, and now found themselves suddenly exposed to a king who valued ability over flattery. Daeron moved swiftly to put things right. He reformed the City Watch and restored order to institutions his father had allowed to decay. He paid the dowry his late father had promised to the Archon of Tyrosh, ensuring that Daemon Blackfyre was married to Roanne of Tyrosh, as Aegon had intended, a deliberate gesture of goodwill toward a half-brother who had every reason to be difficult. By all accounts, Daemon accepted the gesture gracefully. He settled into his new life, took his Tyroshi bride, and within months had twin sons by her. For the moment, the peace held. Daeron's great project was Dorne. What two previous kings had failed to accomplish by force of arms, the full incorporation of Dorne into the Seven Kingdoms, he achieved through marriage. He had already wed the Dornish princess Mireia Martell before becoming king, and now he arranged for his younger sister Daenerys to wed Mireia's brother, Prince Maron Martell of Sunspear. The negotiations were long and careful. Dorne extracted meaningful concessions, and the marriage was celebrated with a grand tourney in 187 AC. It was, by any measure of statecraft, a triumph. Dorne had resisted Targaryen conquest for nearly 2 centuries. Daeron accomplished through patience and diplomacy what dragonfire could not. Daemon rode in the tourney that celebrated the Dornish marriage. He was unhorsed in the final tilt by Daeron's eldest son, Prince Baelor, a result that stung, though Daemon bore it without visible complaint. But around him, men were beginning to talk. The Dornish were now allies. The Dornish were now at court, in numbers that made traditional lords uneasy. Daeron's own heir, the Prince of Dragonstone, had the looks of his Martell mother rather than the silver-gold hair of a Targaryen. Meanwhile, there was Daemon, unmistakably, overwhelmingly Targaryen in appearance, in bearing, in everything the old song said a king should be, standing on the outside of power, holding the conqueror's own sword, celebrated wherever he went, and legally still just a legitimized bastard. The whispers that had been present since Aegon's reign grew louder after the Dornish marriage. Some men asked whether Daeron was truly Aegon's son at all. Those old rumours, the ones Aegon himself had sown, did not die with him. Others pointed out that Daemon's mother Dana had been a Targaryen princess, meaning that Daemon carried the blood of the dragon on both sides in a way that Daeron's children, born of a Dornish mother, could not claim. Singers began composing songs about Daemon and Daenerys, the lost love that the king's diplomacy had sacrificed on the altar of political necessity. The songs made Daemon's loss romantic and tragic, and people loved them, which made Daemon's position simultaneously more sympathetic and more dangerous. Into this atmosphere came the men who would light the fire. The first was Aegor Rivers, Bittersteel, who had hated from birth and had never stopped. Born to Lady Barbara Bracken, one of Aegon's discarded mistresses, he had been exiled from court as a boy when his mother was replaced by a Blackwood woman, and he had grown up nursing that wound alongside every new one that life gave him. By the time he came to Daemon's circle, he was a superb soldier and an absolutely relentless enemy of everything Daeron's court represented. His tongue, it was said, was more dangerous than his steel, and he poured it into Daemon's ear with the patience of a man who had been waiting a very long time to say these things to someone who mattered. He was joined in this effort by Sir Quentyn Ball, known throughout the realm as Fireball, a red-haired knight of volcanic temper who had served as master-at-arms at the Red Keep, training Daeron's own sons alongside the Great Bastards. Fireball had a personal grievance of his own. King Aegon the Unworthy had promised him a place in the Kingsguard when a vacancy arose, and to fulfill that requirement, Fireball had arranged for his wife to enter the Silent Sisters, giving up his marriage so that he could take the oath of perpetual service. When a vacancy did arise under Daeron II, the White Cloak was given instead to a knight named Sir Willem Wilde. Fireball was passed over without explanation. The man had sacrificed his marriage for a promise that the new king simply chose not to honour. These two men, both gifted soldiers and both burning with grievance, spent years working on Daemon. The sources are clear that Daemon did not leap eagerly into rebellion. He was reluctant, and the persuasion took time. He had spent his life being celebrated and treated well enough. He had a wife and growing children. He had lands and income granted by the crown. Bittersteel and Fireball had to work for it, returning again and again with arguments that accumulated rather than arriving in a single decisive conversation. What finally shifted the balance is not recorded with certainty. What is recorded is that around 195 AC, Daemon agreed to betroth his eldest daughter, Calla, to Bittersteel, sealing the alliance between them in the Westerosi way, through blood. After that, the momentum was unstoppable. Word of Daemon's intentions reached Daeron's court before any banner was raised. It has been suggested that it was Brynden Rivers, Bloodraven, who had chosen the Targaryen side as completely as Bittersteel had chosen the other, who had informants close enough to Daemon to know what was being discussed before it became public. Daeron moved to arrest his half-brother, sending the Kingsguard to bring Daemon in. It was Fireball who intervened, using his intimate knowledge of the Red Keep to help Daemon slip free. The attempted arrest, which might have been handled quietly, instead became a public event, and Daemon's supporters used it immediately. Daeron, the supposedly just king, had moved against his own brother without provocation. It was exactly the narrative that Bittersteel had been constructing for years. Daemon raised his banner. He inverted the Targaryen colours. Where the crown flew a red dragon on black, he flew a black dragon on red, and declared himself the rightful king. His supporters called him the Black Dragon. Those who stayed loyal to Daeron called him the Pretender. The distinction depended entirely on which side of the coming war you were standing on, and as Sir Eustace Osgrey, an old knight who would fight for the Black Dragon and live to regret it, observed years later, treason is only a word. When two princes fight for the same chair, great lords and common men alike must choose. And when the fighting is done, whoever wins gets to decide which side was right. Half the realm chose Daemon. The great houses, Lannister, Tyrell, Arryn, remained with the crown, but within each region powerful lords and proud houses declared for the Black Dragon. The Reach and the Stormlands produced the most passionate support from men whose families had spent generations fighting Dorne, and who saw Daeron's peace as a humiliation. The Ironwoods of Dorne, who had their own ancient quarrel with the Martells, joined Daemon from across the Boneway. Houses across the Westerlands, the Riverlands, and even in the Vale had men who put on black and rode to join the rebel host. Some came out of genuine conviction. Others came because Aegon the Unworthy had made enough enemies that half the realm was quietly waiting for an excuse. Others still came simply because Daemon was magnificent, and men wanted to fight beside someone magnificent. Daemon even began minting his own coinage, the act of a man who expected to win, who was already behaving as a king rather than a rebel. Within months of the banner being raised, it was clear this was not a minor revolt to be crushed quickly by a show of force. This was a civil war. The Seven Kingdoms had not seen anything like it since the Dance of the Dragons, 65 years before, when Targaryen had killed Targaryen over a disputed succession and left the dynasty's dragons dead and its power diminished. Now, the cycle was beginning again. Without dragons this time, with only swords and arrows and the lives of tens of thousands of ordinary men to settle the question of who should sit on a throne their ancestors had built from fire. The war that followed lasted the better part of a year, and in those months it came closer to toppling the Targaryen dynasty than anything that had come before it, closer even than the Dance of the Dragons, which had at least been a dispute between two claimants with equally legitimate Targaryen blood. This was something different. This was a realm that had genuinely divided, house against house, brother against brother, with real conviction on both sides. The men who rode for the Black Dragon were not simply malcontents or opportunists, though there were those among them too. Many were committed to Daemon's cause in the way that men are committed to things they believe to be right, and that conviction made them dangerous. Daemon moved quickly once his banner was raised, consolidating his position in the Reach, where his support was deepest. The Lords of the Reach had the longest memory for anti-Dornish grievance. The Marcher houses along the Dornish border had been fighting Dorne in one form or another for generations, and Daeron's peace felt to them less like statesmanship and more like surrender. They came to Daemon in numbers, bringing their knights and their levies, and beneath his black and red standard, the rebel host swelled into something that looked less like a ragtag uprising and more like a royal army. While Daemon marshalled his main strength in the Reach, it was Fireball who ranged far ahead and struck where the Loyalists least expected it. Sir Quentyn Ball rode hard for the Westerlands, deep in territory that was formerly loyal to the crown, and announced his presence by killing Lord Lefford at the very gates of Lannisport. When Lord Daemon Lannister came out to confront him, Fireball defeated him too, sending the Lord of Casterly Rock retreating behind his walls. It was a remarkable display of individual command, Fireball using aggression and speed to make the war feel much larger and more dangerous than it might otherwise have appeared. He then turned south, crossing the Mander, where he slew all the sons of Lady Penrose save for the youngest, whom he spared out of mercy for the woman's grief. Even in victory, there was something in the Blackfyre cause, in Daemon's men at least, that reached for a certain kind of honour. Daeron's position was not desperate, but it was strained. His Hand of the King, Lord Ambrose Butterwell, proved worse than useless in managing the crisis. His loyalty itself came under suspicion, and before the war's end, Daeron replaced him with the more dependable Lord Hayford. House Tyrell of Highgarden marched for the crown and drove Blackfyre's supporters from parts of the Reach, which was a meaningful check on Daemon's base, but Leo Tyrell could not be everywhere, and the rebel positions remained robust. The fighting spread across the Riverlands, across the Vale, through the Westerlands, and into the Stormlands. Localized battles and skirmishes that the historical record has largely lost, but which bled both sides steadily through the months of the war. Some houses played the situation carefully, keeping a foot in both camps. Houses Hightower, Butterwell, Oakhart, and Tarbeck gave measured support to both sides, not out of cowardice necessarily, but out of the cold calculation that in a civil war of this kind, the prudent man does not commit everything until the outcome is clearer. One lord, Manfred Lothston of Harrenhal, had ridden for Daemon and then changed sides entirely, going over to Daeron at a critical moment. Betrayal and opportunism ran in both directions. The rebellion was not a clean contest of ideals. It was a messy, sprawling thing, fought across hundreds of miles of Westerosi terrain, with all the confusion and treachery that civil wars always produce. And yet Daemon's cause continued to advance. By the late months of 196 AC, his army had swept northeast out of the Reach and into the Riverlands, fighting its way toward King's Landing, with a momentum that was becoming difficult to ignore. The capital itself was not yet under siege, but it was within reach. The men around Daemon could see it. The great prize that Bittersteel had spent years arguing was rightfully theirs was close enough now to feel real. Daemon had begun the year as a rebel in flight from an arrest warrant. He ended it commanding one of the largest armies that had marched toward King's Landing since the conquest, with the sword of Aegon the Conqueror at his hip and an entire half of the realm behind him. There was one loss that cut deep before the final battle came. Sir Quentyn Ball, the Fireball, was killed on the eve of the decisive engagement. He stopped to drink from a water source, and an unknown archer's arrow took him. It was the kind of death that wars produce. Unheroic, random, and profoundly unfair. And it robbed the Black Dragon's army of one of its finest commanders at the worst possible moment. There was also a separate misfortune. Lord Bracken had crossed the narrow sea to hire a company of Myrish crossbowmen for Daemon, elite mercenaries who would have added considerable weight to the rebel army's ranged capability. Storms delayed his return, and the crossbowmen never arrived. The rebel host pushed on regardless. King's Landing was close. Daeron's forces had consolidated under the king's new hand, Lord Hayford, and Daeron's own son, Prince Maekar, a hard and capable soldier who had none of his father's scholarly inclinations, had mustered his own forces and moved to intercept. Prince Baelor, Daeron's eldest son and the man many considered the finest prince the Seven Kingdoms had seen in a generation, had ridden south to link up with a Dornish army and was working his way back north. The question was whether he could arrive in time. On the Loyalist side, Bloodraven moved with his raven's teeth, his personal company of elite archers, some 300 men, taking up whatever position would allow them to be most effective when the moment came. The man who had been working against Daemon quietly for years, through intelligence and patience, was now preparing to work against him openly, and in the way Bloodraven always preferred. Not in the thick of the fighting where strength and courage decided things, but at a remove where calculation and a clear line of sight could be made to count for more. Two armies, each large enough to decide the fate of the realm, were now converging on a field in the Crownlands. The war had lasted nearly a year and touched almost every corner of the Seven Kingdoms. Everything. The throne, the dynasty, the peace that Daeron had spent 11 years carefully building, now came down to a single day's fighting on a patch of ground that had no name yet. It would be given one before sundown. The Redgrass Field. The Loyalist army that moved to stop Daemon was commanded in the field by the newly appointed Hand of the King, Lord Hayford, with Prince Maekar, Daeron's fourth son, a hard and capable soldier, leading his own forces alongside. The Raven's Teeth, Bloodraven's 300 elite archers, moved with the royal host. Lord Leo Tyrell of Highgarden had mustered his forces and was marching to join them, but the distance was too great. He would not arrive in time. Daemon's own army was arranged with Lord Costane commanding the left flank and Lord Shawnee the right, with Bittersteel at the head of the right alongside Shawnee. Daemon himself held the centre. His twin sons Aegon and Aemon, 12 years old and serving as their father's squires, rode with him. The rebel host had fought its way across the Seven Kingdoms for the better part of a year. These men had crossed rivers and broken loyalist forces from Lannisport to the Manda. They were tired, they were hardened, and they were close enough to King's Landing to smell the finish. The battle opened with Lord Donal Arryn leading the loyalist vanguard. Daemon hit it like a hammer. He broke Arryn's lines apart, cutting through the formation with the kind of violence that had made men compare him to the warrior made flesh. Will Waynwood fell. The Knight of Nine Stars fell. The Loyalist vanguard, which had been meant to hold and bleed the rebel advance, while the rest of the royal forces organised, came apart instead. For a moment, the Targaryen position looked desperate. Then Sir Gawain Corbray of the Kingsguard rode forward with reinforcements, and everything stopped. Corbray was no ordinary knight. He carried the Valyrian steel sword Lady Forlorn, one of the great blades of Westeros, and he was skilled enough with it to give even Daemon pause. The two men met in the middle of the chaos and fought each other while the battle raged on around them. Two men on horseback, each wielding a Valyrian blade, circling and striking and recovering in what witnesses later described as something closer to a performance than a fight. For nearly an hour they duelled. Every time one of the swords struck the other, people said you could hear the sound of it a league away, a ringing, singing clash that was, as one account later put it, half a song and half a scream. Daemon won. He drove Blackfyre through Corbray's helm and left the Kingsguard knight blinded and bleeding in the dirt. And this is the moment that histories have returned to again and again. Daemon dismounted. Rather than ride on and press his advantage while the loyalists were reeling and leaderless in that section of the field, he stopped. He ordered his man, Red Tusk, to carry Corbray back to the maesters in the rear, to ensure that his fallen opponent was not trampled by the horses still churning around them. It was the act of a man who genuinely believed in the code he fought under, who could not bring himself to abandon a defeated enemy, even when doing so might have won him a throne. It cost him everything. While Daemon stood over his fallen opponent, Bryndon Rivers moved. Bloodraven and his Raven's Teeth had been working their way toward a ridge overlooking the battlefield, the Weeping Ridge. 300 archers took the high ground, looked down at the field below them, and began to shoot. Bloodraven found Daemon's banner and made a calculation that was, by any measure, cold. He targeted Daemon's eldest son, Aegon, first, knowing, because he understood the man he was fighting, that Daemon would never leave his son on the field while there was any chance of reaching him. He was right. Daemon moved toward his son, and Bloodraven's archers put 7 arrows into him. Aemon, Daemon's second eldest twin, saw his father fall and his brother already dead or dying. He picked up Blackfyre, the sword the whole rebellion had been built around, and tried to rally the men around him. Bloodraven's archers killed him too. The rebel army, which had been advancing confidently moments before, had just watched their leader die in front of them, causing them to fall into confusion and come apart. Bittersteel, however, did not run. He reached the bodies, took Blackfyre from Aemon's dead hands, held it above his head, and led a charge directly into the raven's teeth. He drove his forces at Bloodraven's archers with a fury that temporarily turned the rout into something else entirely, scattering the bowmen and buying precious time for whatever fragments of the rebel army could be gathered and moved. He and Bloodraven met in the middle of it. The two men who had hated each other since boyhood, who had competed for their father's favour and their half-sister's love and 100 smaller prizes over decades. They duelled on the Redgrass Field while the battle died around them. It was said to have been second only to the fight between Daemon and Corbray in the spectacle of it. Bittersteel put out Bloodraven's eye, but it was not enough. Prince Baelor Breakspear arrived from the south with a host of Dornishmen and Stormlords, the hammer that Bloodraven's arrows and Maekar's forces had been holding the field to receive. He struck the rebel rear while Maekar rallied what remained of the loyalist van and pressed from the other direction, crushing the Blackfyre forces between two armies in the maneuver that singers later called the Hammer and the Anvil. The rebel army shattered. Lord Hayford, the king's hand, had already been slain by Lord Gormon Peake during the fighting, but his death changed nothing. The battle was decided by the time Baelor arrived, and his arrival simply finished it. 10,000 men died that day. The field had no name when the armies met on it. By evening it had one, because the ground was red, saturated with the blood of 10,000 dead men, sucked into the earth until the grass itself turned the colour of the carnage above it. The Redgrass Field. Bittersteel retreated, somewhere in the chaos of the day's end, with Bloodraven's one remaining eye looking for him, and Baelor's forces still in pursuit. He gathered what could be gathered. Daemon's widow Roanne of Tyrosh, 5 of Daemon's surviving sons, several daughters, the sword Blackfyre, and hundreds of now landless lords and knights who had bet everything on the Black Dragon and lost. He moved them east, across the narrow sea, to the free city of Tyrosh, where Roanne's family held influence, and where Bittersteel could begin the work of deciding what came next. In Westeros, Daeron the Good surveyed the wreckage and made his judgments. He was not, as he had been expected to be, merciful. The lords who had followed Daemon lost lands, titles, or wealth, sometimes all three, and every one of them was required to give hostages to ensure future loyalty. Lord Gormon Peake, who had killed the king's hand, lost 2 of his 3 family castles. Houses across the realm paid in proportion to their involvement. The question of whether a man had fought for the Black Dragon or the Red became, in the years that followed, one of the most dangerous questions you could ask in Westeros. And there was one more thing that did not come home with Bittersteel and the exiles. Blackfyre, the sword of Aegon the Conqueror, the blade that had been the physical argument for Daemon's legitimacy, the steel that every Targaryen king since the conquest had carried. It crossed the narrow sea in Bittersteel's hands and did not return. It would remain in exile with the Blackfyre pretenders for the rest of the dynasty's history, a fact that gnawed at the Targaryens and sustained the pretenders in equal measure. In Tyrosh, Bittersteel looked at the scattered fragments of what had been a rebel kingdom and made a decision. He had watched the exiled Westerosi lords and knights around him begin drifting toward other sellsword companies, dispersing into the professional armies of the free cities, losing their identity and their purpose. He could not allow that. He gathered them into a single company, gave them a name, the Golden Company, and gave them words that told everyone exactly what they were and what they were for. Beneath the gold, the bitter steel. The Redgrass Field may have ended the dreams of Daemon Blackfyre, but it did not end the ambition of the Blackfyre line. The war for the Iron Throne was no longer just a rebellion. It was now a generational struggle that would haunt the Targaryen dynasty for the next 60-odd years. From the secret conspiracies of the Second Rebellion to the brutal chaos of the War of the Ninepenny Kings. Join me in Part 2, where we follow the rise of the Golden Company and the final stand of the Blackfyre pretenders. I'll see you there.